everybody, I'm Sarah and I'm a recorder player. Welcome back to my mini-series Team Recorder Basics, taking you through everything you need to know to get started on the recorder. Today we're going to be going through a brief history of the recorder. There are a lot of centuries, so I'm going to be doing this at lightning speed. Obviously I've had to leave a bunch of stuff out, but if there's something that you think is really important that other people know, please share it in the comments. I just realised I think I blend in with the wall with this jumper. Was this a bad idea? Am I just like a disembodied head? Okay, the construction of the recorder is what we call a duct or fipple flute, and these have been around for thousands and thousands of years. There has been an instrument like this found that is between 35 and 40,000 years old. It was carved from bone, from the wing bone of a vulture, which I think is pretty cool. What we call a recorder is a duct pipe with a thumb hole on the back and 7 holes for your fingers. So that's how we distinguish a recorder from other pipes and whistles. Of course, these pipe and flute-like instruments have existed all over the world in all cultures. For this video, I'm going to be concentrating a bit more on Western classical music. So the first real evidence of the recorder as we know it was seen in the medieval times in the 14th century. Before this, there had been pipe-like instruments depicted in a lot of art from as far back as the 11th century, but we can't be entirely sure if these were like recorders. But then we see, for example, in this painting, The Mocking of Jesus from at some time after 1315, someone very clearly playing a recorder. So we can deduce if they're in artwork like this, they must have been around for a while before then as well. One of the earliest actual recorders found is the Dordrecht recorder. This is from sometime between, what have I written down, 1335 and 1418. It was found in the ruins of a house in Dordrecht in the Netherlands. So this is a recorder that's like 700 years old. And actually a lot of other original recorders from around this time have been found. There was one found in Gottinger in Germany. It was found in an old latrine. And from these medieval recorders that we found, we've been able to start reconstructing how they would have sounded and how the music we played would have also have sounded. Now, in the medieval times, not all music was written down. A lot of it was taught by ear. It's mainly vocal music. Only a handful of instrumental pieces from then survive. But the recorder would have almost certainly been used to play this kind of music. We can also play vocal music from back then because the recorder fits the range of the human voice really well. And a lot of this music would be for open instrumentation. Any instrument can play it. And this is why I always confidently say the recorder has 700, 800, 900 years of repertoire. The instrument existed, the music existed. Why shouldn't they go together? So now we're getting into the Renaissance period, more into the 16th century, and we are seeing an explosion of music, repertoire, and of instruments. Instrument makers were producing recorder consorts, and a consort was a family of instruments designed to be played together. And recorders were also depicted in treatises for the first time. A treatise was basically like an information book. And we can see in these illustrations how they looked. There were fingering charts, there were instructions on how they were played, and some really important ones from that time were by Virdung, Argricola, Praetorius. By the way, I'm throwing a lot of names out here. If you want to know more, use the power of your favourite search engine. And over this period, the shape of recorders gradually changed from cylindrical to conical, so they'd be wider at the bottom than at the top. This had the effect that the range was greater, and it also affected the sound. Recorders were enjoying a high place in society. A big fan of the recorder was King Henry VIII of England, most famous for getting through 6 wives. He loved the recorder. Apparently he had over 50 of his own instruments. He was composing, he was commissioning music. And a lot of pieces written at this time were for open instrumentation. It was set for a recorder or an oboe or a violin or any of these. and the recorder had just as much of a place in music as all of these other instruments. So we're seeing music getting more and more virtuosic. We have La Fontegara by Ganassi, which was also a treatise on how to ornament music, and this gets really complex, pushing the recorder to new limits. And as the music got more complex, the instruments were developing in order to keep up. So I'm going to transition now to the Baroque period. We're getting more into the 17th and then the 18th centuries. By the Baroque period, the recorder had changed drastically. It had a much larger range and a much sweeter sound, so they're almost two different instruments. And as time goes on, we start to see recorders in operas and in orchestras. Think of works by Monteverdi and Handel and Purcell. And the recorder was depicted all over the place in art. This was called iconography. It was used symbolically, so if you saw a recorder in an artwork, it would mean something. It had a lot of different meanings. These involved shepherds and pastoral scenes, but also love scenes because of its shape, the supernatural and death, or birds. And these were also the themes that it would be used to depict within opera. Bach loved a bit of recorder. He was putting them all over the place in his cantatas, also in his orchestral works and concertos. For example, we have the Brandenburg Concerto No. 2, where the soloists are the violin, the oboe, the trumpet, and the recorder. We're up there with the rest of them. It still has a high place in society. For example, in the French courts, we have a lot of dance music from Lully, who was a composer and conductor. He would conduct by banging a stick on the ground, and he apparently died after stabbing himself in the foot. And Telemann, a very important recorder composer, also played a big role in introducing the recorder into people's homes. Now, he was composing prolifically, he was publishing his own music, and he was really encouraging Tafelmusik, which was literally where you would stand around a table and play together at home. And in the Baroque times, we have the Italian Baroque, think Vivaldi concertos, German Baroque, think of Bach, French Baroque, think of Hotteterre, and the recorder is equally at home in all of these. Now we're getting into the classical period and later the Romantic, and people tend to say, oh, the recorder died out and nothing happened for 150 years, but that's not actually true. They were still around and people were still playing them, just not as much. Now, there are a lot of reasons why the recorder could have had this decline. I don't know exactly. A lot of other instruments were developing with keys and modifications and getting more and more complex. Think of the Boehm system flute or an oboe covered in keys. And although keyed recorders were definitely invented, it didn't take off as much as these other ones. But there were definitely similar instruments being composed and played for, the Flageolets, the Czakans. There were composers from CPE Bach to Schultz to Weber to Mendelsohn who were still writing. And there's a lot of repertoire we can get into from this period. We have Herbele and Krahmer and Bousquet, but we can also arguably get into Mendelsohn and Berlioz and some of the later Mozart family. But okay, at the end of the 19th, start of the 20th century, we get a bit of a recorder revival. And this was actually part of a much bigger picture, a bigger early music revival happening throughout Europe. And we're seeing similar things in artwork, in architecture, in literature, in fashion. So this wasn't just like an isolated incident. At this time, the recorder was really seen as a historical artifact, a kind of vintage retro thing, and there were enthusiasts who were keeping it alive. A lot of this was attributed to the Dolmetsch family in England. They were quite a posh family who liked to dress up in Elizabethan clothing and get together and make early music, as you do. And I think Dolmetsch was actually introduced to the recorder at the Conservatorium in Brussels where he had studied. This was an important centre for the early music revival. There were lots of people getting together and unearthing historical instruments. And legend has it that Arnold Dolmetsch had an original Bressan recorder that he actually left behind at a train station. And it was partly this mishap that encouraged him to really do some research and develop and make his own recorder. So that was all happening in England. In the Netherlands, there was also recorder stuff happening with Kees Boeke. It was happening in Germany and France, especially in the area of music education. And the recorder in education was a big part of this. Partly due to the wars, recorders started being produced in bakelite, which was a material that could be produced cheaply, and then they were introduced in schools. There was actually a lot of opposition to recorders being introduced as a school instrument because people really felt that they were way too difficult for children. So when people say, oh, it's just an easy kids instrument, it's really not. To master this instrument, as I'm sure you'll know, is hard. Okay, so the recorder is growing throughout Europe, also in the USA, it's there too, and we're starting to get repertoire by big name composers, Hindemith, Ligeti, Britten, Berstein. Around the 1940s, we're seeing a lot of neoclassical and neo-Baroque works for the recorder. These were quite sweet and nostalgic. Think of a soprano recorder with a grand piano. Then in the Netherlands, Kees Boeke had a recorder student called Frans Bruggen, who is arguably one of the most important people in the recorder history. Now you have to think, at this time, all of that Baroque, Renaissance, medieval music existed, but it hadn't been rediscovered yet. Now we can just go to IMSLP and we have all of these amazing pieces. But the people back then were reconstructing it and having to do the research from scratch. And not only did he reconstruct and record a huge amount of early music, he was also commissioning new works. In the 1960s, we get our first two proper, real, contemporary pieces for the recorder. They were Suite by Louis Andriessen and Gesti by Berlioz, and both of these just exploded the boundaries of what the recorder can do. And since the 1960s, there have been more original works for recorders composed than in all the centuries before. We have come a long way. So Frans had two students called Walter van Houwer and Kees Boeke. And Walter and Kees went on to found the recorder department, the block system, at the Conservatorium in Amsterdam in the 1970s. And they also commissioned a huge amount of new works, and their students did, and everything started to grow. At this point, I want to say, I know I'm talking about Amsterdam a lot, and although it's very important, it's definitely not the only place in the world, but it is where I live and have studied, so that's why I know a bit more about it than other places. So from here we see the recorder really explode all over the world. And it's interesting to see these little pockets where it's happening. For example, in the 50s and 60s, we have a lot of avant-garde compositions from Germany. In the 70s and 80s, we're seeing all of these new pieces coming out of Japan. In the 90s, we're seeing all of these virtuosic contemporary works in Italy. And in the meantime, there are great conservatories where you can study the recorder all over Europe and all over the world. And today there are thousands of professional recorder players working in this field all over the world. I actually decided not to name people because I don't want to miss anyone out. Our instrument has also continued to develop. We still play on what you can refer to as a Baroque recorder, but we have started to see instruments with keys, or the labium is different. We have the Herbele instruments, the Petzold Kunat, the Eagle, the Philippe Bolton electroacoustic recorders, the Elodie. And there are also new developments, reconstructions happening with historical models. After all, a lot of the early recorders we play are reconstructions that we've had to figure out. For example, Adriana Broking making the 3-meter tall subcontrabass recorder. And today the recorder is used in orchestras, in concertos, in mixed chamber music, as a solo instrument, with live electronics, in theatre, in rock and pop music, in folk, everything you can imagine. In my opinion, it's just going to keep going up and up and up, and something really important for that is you guys who are enthusiastic about the instrument, who are learning it and enjoying it, and that is what is important in the end. I feel like I've forgotten so much, but you know, I've done my best to summarise 40,000 years in this little video. That was my little history of the recorder. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you'd like to know about other aspects of this, for example how the instruments have developed or the specific repertoire, then do let me know. As always, you can subscribe to my channel by clicking on my face down here in the corner. If you'd like to support the channel, you can do that by heading over to our Patreon page, and up here is a link to last week's video in the Team Recorder Basics series. Thanks so much for watching and have a great day.